Today we're going to bed this barreled Winchester Model 70 Action to this stock. But before we get into this, I want to say there is no one way to bed an Action to a stock. We have to make allowances for all of the differences between all of the different rifles out there. So there's differences between stocks and brands and models, and even the Winchester Model 70 itself. There are differences between the 1936 Winchester Model 70 Standard versus a 2013 Winchester Model 70 Featherweight. A lot of differences. And then all of the various Model 70s produced in between. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and bed this one, and I'm going to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing as we go. And then hopefully that'll give you an idea as to how to deal with some of the things you can run into with any rifle when you're bedding it to a stock. The one thing that is common for all bedding jobs is to make sure we have everything we're going to need for that bedding job ready to go before we start and organized. We don't want to get 3/4 of the way into it and realize I forgot something or I can't find something. So I've got everything we're going to need for this job here. And this also means thinking through ahead of time the entire process so that you can realize, all right, this is going to be an issue here. I might need this instead of that. A great example. And this is the one thing you want to watch out for all rifles. Do you have a through hole or a blind hole? All right, so in the case of this Winchester Model 70 here, almost all Winchester Model 70s on the rear tang screw, it's a through hole. For this one, it's a blind hole. Right. For that reason, I'm not going to use the Action screws on the rear hole. I'm going to use this stock inletting screw or stud and screw it in the hole ahead of time so that when I set this into the Action, it's going to fill the hole and I can't get epoxy in here. Epoxy in blind holes is a bad thing. Okay, now for the front Action screw, it doesn't matter. I can put a lot of release agent inside of the Action, right, and then put this in the epoxy, and then I can just run the front Action screw in. It'll push some epoxy and putty that I'm going to use to fill this hole with. It'll push that through into the inside of the Action. But so long as there's a release agent there, it's not a problem. It'll come right out. If this were a Mauser 98, a Howa, or a Ruger Model 77, those all have a blind hole in the recoil lug instead of a through hole. All right, big difference. All right, in that case, if we just ran the Action screw into that blind hole, we're going to push stuff up into where the threads are for the barrel. And we're not going to be able to get it out. Right, that's not good. And that's what I mean by thinking everything through. So for this, we're going to start by removing this trigger. And I could leave the trigger on here and I'd probably be okay. But I sure don't want to risk it. I don't want to take a chance on getting epoxy inside of this trigger because then we would have a problem. And removing the triggers is simple, like everything else, just having the tools and know-how. And all it is there's a rear pin for the bolt release it's spring-loaded. So I'm just going to release that spring or the tension on it. Drop it off to the side. I'm going to take a 1/16 inch punch and just push that through. And then the bolt release and spring, it's all just going to come right off. We'll set that to the side and we will need it later. And then for the front screw, a ball peen hammer, 1/8 inch roll pin punch. And this is just going to punch right out. Triggers out of the way and we don't have to worry about that. The next thing I want to take care of is this barrel channel. This is a Winchester factory stock and I'm replacing the stock that came on this rifle. They're identical stocks. This one just warped on me. Winchester bedded the action ease, 2-point bedding on this stock from the factory, and they free floated the barrel. Well, they cut the barrel channel oversized to allow for the free floating. Now, for a stock that the barrel was not free floated and the action was not bedded, okay, I would bed the action, then come back after everything had set up, and then sand down the barrel, remove some wood, and correct my clearance. This already has the clearance in it, so Winchester was putting some sort of shim in here to level everything up and make sure the barrel was centered. So what I want to do is wrap some electrical tape around the barrel itself. We're going to use that to shim up the barrel and to center the barrel in this channel. We don't want this off to one side and then our epoxy set up and then it's just that way permanently. Not good. And in this case, I've already measured my electrical tape. That's what I'm using. You could use any kind of tape. 2 wraps should get me. I might do a third if it's too tight, or not tight enough if it's still too loose. But that's going to give me 13 thousandths of clearance with 2 wraps. I'm going to go one more wrap on it. I've still got a little more play in there than I want. And I don't know how much Winchester, how much clearance they intended for it to have from the factory. And if it's still too loose, we'll do a fourth wrap. All right, that took out all the play right there. So that's what we want. Next steps, I want to rough up the surfaces just a little bit with a Dremel tool to help the epoxy adhere to the wood. And we call it glass bedding, but it's epoxy. And this is especially important for a synthetic stock because they tend to be a lot slicker, and I have seen the bedding break loose from synthetic stocks many times. This one, Winchester designed this stock with bedding in mind, so I don't even need to do that with this stock. In the front, I'm not even going to rough it up. With the way it's cut, the epoxy is going to lock in there. For the rear, I want to lock it up. I want to break that surface just a little bit, rough it up just a little bit. But I want to make sure part of the flats for the original height are still there. In other words, I don't want to go removing material. Then when I put the action in here, the rear tang wants to come down because it doesn't have anything to support it. So again, I'm just going to rough it up a little bit. The only thing left now to prep the stock is just painter's tape, and that way if I get any overrun from the epoxy when I put the action in there, it's not sticking to the wood. It's on tape. That looks pretty good. Now I want to drop this action in just to make sure I don't have any tape edges catching or interfering. And I can actually add more tape around this tank here. And that looks pretty good. Now we can call the stock ready to go. Now we need to move on to the action. For the action, I want to start with plumber's putty. And what I'm going to do is just fill up any of the little nooks and crannies and holes that the epoxy could get into and form a hook that would cause it not to want to release. All right, so the bolt release pin, that's a really good spot right close to this tang where there's going to be a lot of epoxy for that epoxy to get in there and just cause some issues. So I'm going to fill this in and all of the little holes through here. And I'm also going to add some plumber's putty to the hole in the action for the front action screw. And the reason for that is I'm going to use the long screw for the back because it's a blind hole. But I'm going to use the standard action screw for the front, and I'll explain why when we get to that part. Finally, for the release agent, and I just want to coat everything really well with this Kiwi Neutral shoe polish, and I'm going to start by just putting it on with my finger and just absolutely putting it to it. And I want to cover places that I don't even think I'm going to get epoxy, just in case. And there's a lot of epoxies that can be used, a lot of release agents. I'm just not really that particular. I think they all do a good job. That's why I use the Kiwi. I think it does a great job as a release agent. At least I've never had one stick with it. And it's not supposed to leave the film on it is extremely small compared to a lot of other release agents, which is good because that means it's going to be a better fit to the bedding material. There's not going to be a lot of this between the epoxy and the steel itself. And I also want to make sure I add this to the inside of the action here. And I applied that really liberally just to hurry up and get everything coated. But now I want to come back in with a brush. I'm using an old paintbrush. And I'm just going to go over it all really well because I don't want any high spots. I don't want it caked up anywhere. I just want a nice film when we're done. Got a paper towel just to wipe away any excess if I went too far overboard. And one thing I almost forgot is I need to put some tape on the recoil lug. It wouldn't have been the end of the world if I'd forgotten it, but I do want 2 layers of tape on the back of the recoil lug. It'll make it easier getting the action out of the stock. And I should have done this before applying the release agent because that's probably going to make the tape not want to stick, but I'll just clean the release agent off the recoil lug if I have to. So let me get this done real quick. And it's actually sticking pretty good to that recoil lug, so we're okay. Now to add a little release agent to the tape itself. Make sure it turns loose. Now I want to go back over everything one more time with the brush, especially the areas that are going to make contact. All right, I want those surfaces just really smooth and slick as they can be. And with that, I have triple checked everything. Now I'm ready to mix the Acro glass. And I've got some JB Weld on hand. That would have done great. It's just I've got more of this than I do JB Weld. So we're using the Acro glass. And I've had great results with both in the past. And this is really forgiving on mixing. It's 1-to-1. And what I've got is an applicator here for a Bondo applicator from the parts store. And I just cut it down into strips to give me whatever size I need. All right, so I'm going to take a clean one and I'm going to dip out so much of one part. Now another clean strip, just so I don't contaminate the two. And I'm going to dip out so much of the hardener to activate it. I'm just going to eyeball it and make sure I get about the same quantity. That looks pretty close. Now to just mix the two thoroughly. And that's the thing, mix them thoroughly. And now I'm going to add just 1 drop of black dye. There we go. And the great thing about the dye, it'll look a lot better, but it'll also let me know when it's thoroughly mixed, because that 1 drop will turn all of this absolutely pitch black. And something I should have done before ever touching the dye, put on some gloves. That way I just don't have to worry about getting anything all over my hands. Now for me, this is the trickiest part of the whole thing right here, is how much do you put inside the recessed lugs? Because it really doesn't take much. And when we press the action in, it's going to cause that to expand. So a little bit more. I'd rather have too much than not enough. Basically, all I did was fill up the recessed lug and just a little bit out in front. The rest should fill in on its own just from the lug itself going in that recess. That's going to displace a lot of the what's in there on the epoxy. We'll add a little bit more out in front. That's the area there. I really want it right. So I don't want any voids. And on the rear, it's not going to take much at all for that rear. So that looks pretty good there. All right, we're ready to drop this action in. We're looking good on the front. We want to drop it straight in. Straight in and a little pressure to the back. The reason I want to use the front action screw is because of the bottom metal. If this were a synthetic stock and there was just a hole, then I'd use the straight stud for the front also. But being that this isn't, I want to make sure this screw's actually putting pressure on the bottom metal to line it up also, because it needs to fit square to the stock. There we go, that worked out pretty good. I'm going to torque that front screw. Not a lot, but it is torqued. And for this back, since I don't have a screw to torque this back in, I'm going to put a wood clamp on here. Okay, this was just to get everything in place, and I wanted to apply pressure with the clamp and the front screw to squeeze the epoxy out of whatever holes, crevices it's in. Right, and seems that we've done that. Everything's fitting flush where it should be. Now I'm going to take some electrical tape, and this is actually what's going to apply the pressure. I'm going to wrap it in electrical tape. You can use surgical tubing, anything flexible like this that's going to act over the entire surface. That way it applies even pressure. And I just happen to always have a lot of electrical tape laying around. I never have surgical tubing laying around. And the reason for electrical tape and not like painter's tape is because the electrical tape has some elasticity to it. And that's what we're going to use, is that elasticity to apply pressure. So I want to pull it tight. Now I can get rid of this clamp. And I want to make sure I don't cover up that front action screw. And now that I've done all that, now I'm going to back off just a hair on this front action screw. And now I'm going to retighten it, but I'm not going to apply much at all. So there's almost no torque on this. The pressure's coming from the tape, not the screws. Well, we've just got good, nice, even, consistent pressure all the way across the action. Well, at this point, there's nothing to do but just wait and see, and this is the most maddening part. Just waiting for it to set up to see if I got it right or if I messed up. But even if I messed up, I mean, there's ways to fix anything. But I think I nailed it on this one. And normally, I would let this sit up for a couple of hours, let the acrylic glass get stiff, not hard, but just so that it was pliable but no longer sticky. And then I'd come out here and do the cleanup and get rid of any excess that had come out. I don't have a bit of excess on this. I think I got what amount I put in here, I think I nailed it, and it's about perfect. So there's no cleanup on this. And I would also break the front action screw loose just to make sure. But since I backed off on it pretty good and I've got the tape holding everything together, and it's way past my bedtime at this point, I think I'm just going to call it a night, let this sit up, and then tomorrow we'll unwrap it and see what we got. It hasn't quite been 24 hours, but it's been close enough. And the epoxy left over from yesterday, it has set up really well. It's not quite as cured as I'd like it, but this sat out in the shop all night last night, and it's pretty cool. I carried the rifle indoors with me, and temperature is important as far as epoxy setting. So I'm sure the rifle's going to be fine. Now, with that said, I'm sure you're just as anxious as I am to see how this came out. So let's get this one unwrapped. Let's get the bottom metal off. And I did break this stock setting screw or stud loose last night to make sure it wouldn't stick, and everything seems to have turned out well with it. See what we got. Oh, it's tight. I figured it would be. And I'm also positive my tape on the recess lug is going to stick inside the recess. That painter's tape always does. But it's not hard to get out. And so what we got here. Yeah, I think that turned out really well. Yep, my painter's tape, it did stick, but that's okay. We will get that out. And that looks really close to the original factory bedding that they did. Very close. And yes, the painter's tape is coming right out. Every bit of it. And I don't appear to have any epoxy inside of that front screw hole for that front action screw that I was worried about. I can see all the putty in there and everything looks great on that. So that's not an issue. I just want to make sure I get all of that out of the action. If epoxy were in the action in here, it would be very important to get it out. Let's put it that way. Now with the release agent and the putty and everything else out of here, I want to make sure I wipe everything down really, really good and get just a ever so slight coat of oil on the bottom metal here. Now to get this trigger back in here. And the only thing to do now is just find out how she's going to shoot. I am pleased with that. I think that turned out really well. And I'm glad to have my 7mm Mauser back in action. Functional again. It's been in parts for too long. But again, we're not going to know for certain and what we've got till we get to the range. So we're going to try our best to get to the range this coming week. And I'm going to go back to the load testing, the 257 Roberts also. So this coming weekend, we should be shooting both of them. Lord willing, and the creeks don't rise. Hard to say this time of year with the weather, but that's the plan. And one thing I did forget to mention, the rear hole in the stock for the rear action screw, it needs to be drilled out so that it's approximately 50 thousandths larger in diameter than the action screw itself. And for this rifle, that's going to be an L drill. And I've got one on the way. It hadn't arrived yet. That's why I forgot to do that. So I'm going to have to go back this week and drill that out. But for any rifle with 2-point bedding, you want clearance in that rear hole. All right, that lets the wood move, and wood's going to move. And it keeps from putting stresses on the stock when it does move. And that's really helps with the accuracy. So I did want to mention that. And I think that covered it for the bedding on this one. And hey, we got it back together. And all the other components, I didn't remove all of the other hardware like the sling studs and recoil pad from the stock for the bedding. I had all of that off anyway and figured I'd go ahead and do the bedding without that there, just so I wouldn't have to worry about it. But she's back together now. And I want to thank all of you for your prayers and best wishes for Mrs. River. Her surgery went great last week. She's not getting around too well right now, but she's healing quick, so greatly appreciated. And I hope to see y'all at the range next week. God bless and have a great day.